Most nights my duty is nothing more than circling the fences, boots crunching gravel, making sure no one slips in to strip copper from the loading docks and making sure nobody's stealing copper from the loading docks. Once, the highlight of the shift was a raccoon setting off a motion sensor, its eyes glowing in the dark like tiny burning coals. I guess that was the most exciting thing. But let me get on with it. My coworker, the only thing that keeps this job from driving me insane is Harlan. He's a 46-year-old guy and has been doing security here for a few years, and he's got a story for everything. I mean, you can't walk past a vending machine without Harlan telling you about the time one fell on a guy he knew. Can't mention the weather without hearing about the tornado that missed his house by 49 feet. Back in 9. Now, Harlan used to be a correctional officer. He did it for 7 years at a federal facility about 4 hours west of here before his knee gave out and he had to find easier work. He loves talking about those days, usually in a nostalgic way. Sometimes in a way that's more like processing stuff. One night we were doing our midnight patrol, flashlights slicing across cavernous shadows, walking the empty warehouse together, and Harlan got going about this inmate he knew. Called him Mitch, Harlan said. Don't know where that nickname came from, but it stuck. His real name was Daniel something. A big guy, probably 262, always smiling. He was nice enough that he'd share his commissary with the new guys, help them figure out the system. Mitch was doing 17 years for voluntary manslaughter. When Harlan first met him, he was on year 17. Straightforward enough. Mitch had come home early from work one day and found a neighbor in his son's room. His son was 5 years old. Mitch pulled the man off his son, dragged him to the front yard, and beat him until the cops arrived. On the way to the hospital, Mitch sat on the front steps waiting for the police. His son wrapped in a blanket beside him. Mitch told me the whole thing one day. Harlan said, "We were just talking. You know how you do." And he goes, "Harlan, if God himself gave me the chance to go back and change what I did, I'd do the exact same thing, maybe worse." He wasn't trying to sound tough. He was just stating facts. Harlan explained how Mitch had gone up for parole twice and had been denied both times. He figured it was because he wouldn't show remorse for what he did. How could he? His son was 23 years old. Now, had a job, a girlfriend, and came to visit whenever he could. That man could have destroyed all of that and nearly dead. Mitch had 1 year left on his sentence. When this kid Elias showed up, Harlan continued. 17 years old and for aggravated assault. He beat 3 guys half to death outside a bar. Said they'd insulted God or something. Harlan said Elias was the kind of guy who was all religious while in jail, but in a twisted and dark way. Everything was about righteousness and punishment. He quoted scriptures constantly, but only the most violent parts. Put Elias in the cell next to Mitch's. For about a week, things were quiet. Mitch even tried being friendly with the kid. Same as he always was with people. Just nice. Then something changed. Elias started giving Mitch these looks and started to move away when Mitch walked by. Here's where it gets real messed up. Harlan said he stopped to lean against a rail. Somehow Elias got the story wrong. I never figured out if someone had told him the story backwards on purpose or if he misheard. But Elias thought Mitch was in there for touching his own son, not for killing the guy who did it, but for being the guy who did it. Harlan said the rumor mill in prison is vicious and not always accurate. Stories get transformed and details get swapped. By the time information makes 3 or 4 jumps, it barely resembles the truth. Elias spent a couple of days working himself up, reading his Bible. Praying loudly about vengeance and protecting the innocent. Other inmates noticed, but nobody knew what he was planning. Even if they had, who'd have thought he'd go after Mitch? Mitch was solid and well-liked and had connections. Yeah, I found him, Harlan said quietly. It was in the afternoon. Mitch's cell door was cracked, which was not supposed to be that way. They're supposed to be locked during that time. Harlan had pushed open the door. Mitch was on the floor, and his head was 7 feet away by the toilet. Elias had fastened himself a shiv, and he must have caught Mitch while he was taking a nap. That was the only way a kid like Elias could have taken down someone Mitch's size. Man, Harlan said. Mitch's eyes were open. On his head, looking right at me from across the cell. I've always wondered if he was seeing me, still conscious in that head, watching me. What kind of hell is that for a man to go through? Harlan looked at me then. Never seen him so sad before. He said, Tommy, sometimes I think this world punishes the good and it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, punishing and punishing the people who want to do good. We were quiet for the remainder of the night. A couple of days after this, I would ask Harlan what happened to Elias. I wanted to know if that guy got life in prison, and apparently he did. But that really wasn't a satisfying end to a story. I feel bad for Gary. And after all that's been happening lately in the world, I'm starting to think Mitch is right. Ones are left to do it again. I've been debating whether to share this for a while. Even typing it out feels like I'm breaking some unspoken rule. But after listening to enough of these stories, I figure maybe it's time someone heard mine. I'm going to keep some details vague, like where this happened exactly, the exact prison and names. You understand? Even retired now, there are things you don't talk about. What happened during those months when I was pulling every extra shift I could get? That's been eating away at me for years. A couple decades back, my wife Linda and I were going through it. Really going through it. 20 years of marriage and we'd hit a wall that felt insurmountable. Every conversation turned into an argument and every silence felt loaded with resentment. Home became a battlefield and I was losing. I'd been working as a correctional officer for about 12 years at that point. It's not a job you brag about at parties, though. When you actually did, people would ask for stories about inmates and prisoners, who was the freakiest guy you had to watch over and all that stuff. Now, when things got bad at home, I started to volunteer for every overtime shift they would give me. Doubles, nights, holidays, it didn't matter. Break room. Different world from the day shift. During the day, there's activity everywhere. Inmates are moving to work. Assignments and there's visitations and medical appointments, even classes. It's controlled chaos, but it's alive. At night, it's supposed to be quiet. Supposed to be. Keep that in mind. Our facility was old. I think it was built around the early 1900s, but don't quote me on that. There were 3 main wings radiating from a central hub, plus the warden's hall. Hadn't been used for housing in about a decade due to budget cuts and declining population. They kept talking about renovating the place, but the money never really materialized. So, it just sat there empty, collecting dust and rumors. Weeks into my marathon of overtime shifts. It was around 5-5 a.m., that dead time, when even the restless inmates have finally settled in. I was walking past the junction where B-wing meets the central corridor when I heard it. I can describe it as a sort of slow creaking sound, like rope being pulled taut. It lasted maybe 6 seconds and then stopped. I chalked it up to maybe pressure or Something causing sounds and shifting in the building. Clinging or wind coming through old vents you didn't know were there. And every nook and cranny in that place needed some WD-40. When you practically live there for a while, you learn to tune most of it out. But then other guards began to mention it, too. Walt, who had been there even longer than me, brought it up during shift change one morning, asking me if I'd ever heard that weird creaking sound, said it would happen around 4 or 5:28. I admitted I had. He said that he'd started hearing it about 11 months ago. That it was always near the North Block junction. That's when Cliff, one of the younger guards, actually, chimed in with the story. Everywhere has their legends, even prisons, I might say. Especially prisons. Ghost stories passed down through generations of guards and inmates. Ours was about a Warden Monroe. This would have taken place back in the 60s. Warden Monroe had been running a whole operation, smuggling contraband, taking bribes, even allegedly helping certain inmates with outside business, if you know what I mean. Story goes that when the feds started to close in, he knew it was over. Rather than face trial and probably end up in his own prison with people that might kill him, thinking he might have leaked something to the police, he decided to hang himself. And here's the part that made everyone uncomfortable. He did it right here in the prison and what's now the abandoned North Block. I remember yelling bull crap as soon as Cliff finished the story, but Walt shook his head at me. He said he had looked up some records after our last conversation. Said he'd found documents saying they'd found him in 1962 hanging from the ceiling in cell block N2. After that, I started to pay more attention. I didn't want to believe it. But I kind of did. I mean, Walt said he had found the files, right? Could be anything. It was always between 7 and -2-5 a.m., and always near that junction. And it did sound exactly like rope under tension, a distinctive creaking groan. One night, about 4 months into my overtime marathon, I was working with Morales. He's a good, reliable guy, not prone to hysteria or anything. We were doing the 1-3 a.m. count when we both heard something. Something that was clear as day. But this time, it didn't stop after just a few seconds. It went on for maybe 32 seconds, and it got louder as it went, more strained. And it was followed by a scream. A scream that came from the east wing. A man's voice. Raw and desperate and pained, cut short like someone had hit the mute button. Oh, we looked at each other. Protocol said we had to check it out. Wing was supposed to be empty, but sometimes homeless people found ways in or inmates managed to get where they shouldn't be. We called it into control, grabbed our flashlights, and headed over. Control room. Jeffers was the officer on duty that night, and he gave us a strange look when we requested it. Double-checking if we'd actually heard anything at all. We told him we were sure. Dust in the air and slightly wincing at the smell of mold and abandoned places. You know that smell like dampness and decay. We did a full sweep. Every cell, every corner, every possible hiding spot. And there wasn't anything yet. Nothing. No signs of entry, no disturbed dust except for our own footprints. All intact and painted shut. Cell N1, the cell where Monroe allegedly died, the air felt noticeably much colder. And I swear there was a different smell in there. Faint but distinct. Like rope. Old and oiled rope. Morales felt it too. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the ceiling. We filed our report after that. Nothing found. Probably the building settling. Sound carrying weird through the old vents. But we both knew that scream was not the building. Things got worse after that. More guards reported hearing sounds. Not just the rope creaking, but footsteps now in the east wing. Cell doors slamming and whispering in the walls. Collins swore he saw a shadow figure near the junction one night. And a guy named Riley put in for a transfer after he claimed something touched his shoulder while he was doing rounds alone. Even the inmates felt it. Cells were closest to the north block began to ask for transfers, too. An old-timer, I think his name was something like Barlow. I do remember he'd been in there for 28 years and told me straight up, that wing ain't empty, boss. Something's wrong over there. But it was what happened on November 15th that made me reevaluate everything. That day, I'd been working for almost 15 hours straight. I pulled a double and was covering part of another shift because someone had called in sick. It was 4:52 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was looking at my watch, counting down the hours until I could go home to my empty house at the time. My wife was staying somewhere else. I was alone doing the rounds in the corridor near the East Wing junction. Decided to really listen to it to try to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. I stood perfectly still at the junction, holding my breath. The creaking got louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the East Wing at all. It was coming from above me. I looked up, shining my flashlight at the ceiling. There was an old maintenance hatch there, painted over so many times it was barely visible. The creaking was coming from beyond it. Every instinct told me to walk away, finish my rounds, and just forget that I heard anything. But something, maybe curiosity, stupidity, sleep deprivation, made me grab a chair from the nearby break room. I stood on it and pushed at the hatch. It took some effort, but it popped down, showering me with decades of dust and paint chips. That smell hit me immediately. That faint rope smell from cell N8, but much stronger. I hoisted myself up, flashlight in my mouth. It was a crawl space, maybe -1 feet high, extending in both directions. Old pipes and electrical conduits. And there about 11 ft away, there was something that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a beam running perpendicular to the others and newer, looking like it had been added after the original construction. And hanging from it was a rope. Not an old rope. This one looked fresh, like it could have been put there yesterday. And at that very moment, it was swaying slightly, even though there was no air movement in the crawl space. I reached out to touch it, and I swear to you, the moment my fingers made contact, I heard the scream again, not from the East Wing this time, but from right next to me, like someone was standing in that cramped space, screaming directly into my ear. I jerked back so hard I nearly fell through the hatch. I scrambled down, not caring how much noise I made. I slammed the hatch shut and stood there, heart pounding. I was trying to process what I had just experienced. It looked new. And the beam, it looked like it shouldn't have belonged, like it had been installed there for that exact purpose. I finished my shift and filed a report about checking the maintenance hatch due to unusual sounds, and I recommended it to be sealed. I never mentioned the rope. That's the kind of crazy sounding crap you don't want in your reports. The warden's hall killing time before my shift, I decided to look into the Monroe story more thoroughly. I'd found something interesting. Warden Monroe was not the only suicide in our prison. There had been 2 other suicides in the prison's history, one in 1982 and one in 2000. An assistant warden and a guard, respectively. And you know what really freaks me out? They both allegedly killed themselves by hanging. After all that, I put in for day shifts again. I told my supervisor I needed to work on my marriage instead of running from it. And that wasn't a lie. Space to think, to realize what we were throwing away. We started counseling. People always told me that stuff didn't work, but for us, I think it did because we started to talk again instead of yelling. Now, it wasn't easy, but we made it work. And now, all these years later, we're still together. And I can tell you with full honesty, I never worked another night shift in my life. Before I go, let me say something. There are jobs where you clock in, do your work, and clock out without taking anything home with you. Prison guard on. The night shift is not one of those jobs. You carry those shadows with you. Even years later, even federals away, even when you're lying next to your wife in your safe, warm bed, you still sometimes hear that creaking sound in the darkness. My brother watched over criminals from Ibit Island. My brother watched over criminals from Ibit Island. My brother Mark works as a co at a federal facility about 35 minutes from where we both live. Every other Saturday we get together at his place. He's got a nice fire pit set up in the backyard with a couple of lawn chairs, and we bring out a cooler full of beer every time. My German Shepherd, Rex, and his Beagle Mix, Copper, chase each other around while we shoot the crap. Mark doesn't talk about work much. He says most of it's boring paperwork and counting heads. But sometimes, especially after his third or fourth beer, he'll lean back and say something like, "Had a weird one this week." That's when I know I'm about to hear something that'll stick with me. Last year, he told me 2 stories that I'm not going to forget anytime soon. Not ghost stories exactly, but the kind of thing that makes you wonder what really goes on behind those walls. Harold something, but everyone called him Stripes because of these distinctive birthmarks all over his arms and neck. He was a model prisoner. He kept to himself and worked in the laundry. Mark said it started when they noticed Stripes was not eating. Not like a hunger strike or anything political. He'd take his tray, sit down, push the food around, and then just dump it. This went on for about 4 weeks. Medical checked him out and everything. Said he was losing weight, but his vitals were otherwise fine. They took him to psych, but Stripes insisted that nothing was wrong. He just wasn't hungry. Then the smell started. It was coming from Patch's cell. They tossed his cell thinking he was hoarding food. Maybe that's why he wasn't eating in the mess hall, but they didn't find anything. No contraband, no food, nothing that could have caused the smell. But everyone could smell it. Was complaining at a certain point. They moved his cellmate out because the guy was gagging. They made Patches strip and checked everywhere a person could hide anything. But again, nothing. So they moved him to a different cell and the smell moved with him. Now my brother Mark was on duty the night they figured it out. He was doing a count around 02 a.m. when he heard this wet sound coming from Patch's cell. He shone his light in and saw Stripes standing at his sink hunched over. Mark called him to step back, but when Stripes turned around, Mark saw his mouth was full of blood. At first, Mark thought Stripes had hurt himself, tried to kill himself, maybe. Medical was called and backup. When they arrived in the cell, they found something else entirely. Stripes had been eating himself. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. He had been using a sharpened piece of plastic. They never found out where he got it, but he used it to carefully slice small pieces of flesh from his inner thighs and lower stomach, just in the right places where it wouldn't show during normal interactions. Rotting flesh. His own rotting flesh that he'd been consuming and let rot away. When they asked him why he did this, Stripes just said, "Well, I have to feed it." Feed what? They transferred him to the psychiatric facility the next morning. Mark heard later that they had to put him in full restraints because he wouldn't stop trying to bite chunks out of his arms. Of severe delusional disorder, possibly triggered by stress due to incarceration. But Mark said what stuck with him was how rational Patches seemed about it. He wasn't raving or crying or fighting. Until they took him to the psych ward. And he spoke about it like it was just something he has to do, like taking medicine, brushing your teeth. From his beer, was that after they took him away, we found these drawings under his mattress, dozens of drawings, and we all assumed it was him drawing the thing in his stomach, but it looked like a baby with weird teeth and too many fingers. And creepy enough, it was getting bigger in each picture. Rex had come over while Mark was telling his story and rested his head on my knee, like the story had even freaked him out. I scratched behind his ears, trying to ignore the image in my head. Which is basically solitary. They had a prisoner named Zed, who'd killed his cellmate over a card game, stomped the man's head in while he slept, a real piece of work. He was in SEG, pending trial for murder. He'd been in there for 6 months. Zed had this habit of talking to himself. Nothing unusual in Seg. Isolation-like. That makes people do things. But Zed would have full conversations. Both sides, and he would change voices depending on the side. Ignored it. To them it was background noise. They had more important things to worry about. But Mark got assigned to Seg for a week when they were short-staffed. Listen, because something about his speech seems off. Zed is speaking, but there's a pause after. Then he responds to himself. Except the response comes from the opposite side of the cell. Mark explained it like this. Zed was standing at his cell door talking toward the back wall. Normal voice asking questions. How long have you been here? What's your name? Why won't you leave? But the answers were coming from the back corner of the cell where Zed wasn't standing. And it wasn't an echo or some acoustic trick. It was clearly, as Mark described it, a different voice answering. Someone who sounded older and raspier. Mark shined his light inside to check on Zed. Was standing alone at the door, but he was looking at the corner like he could see someone there. Who are you talking to? Mark asked. Zed looked at Mark and he looked relieved. You can hear him too. Thank God. I thought I was going crazy. He's been in here for weeks. Mark called someone else over so he wouldn't have to be alone. He was thinking Zed was having a psychotic break. But over the next few days, every guard assigned to that section reported the same thing. Zed talking to someone. Responses coming from empty air. They checked the cell for anything like hidden speakers or ventilation tricks that might explain it, but they didn't find anything. On the 4th night, Mark was watching the security monitor for that cell. Zed asleep on his bunk. Mark saw him clearly on the grayscale feed. Then he saw something else with him. A shadow, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Standing in the corner. It wasn't Zed. He was still on the bunk. There for a few moments, then moved. It didn't walk. It just moved like it had slid across the floor without taking any steps. It stopped next to Zed's bunk and leaned over him. That's when Zed shot upright and began to scramble back against the wall. On the monitor, Mark could see him screaming, but the shadow thing just stood there. And in a moment, it was gone. Once again, it didn't walk away, but it was just gone between one frame to the next. They moved Zed the next morning and by then he was practically catatonic. He wouldn't speak except to whisper. He says he lives here. He says I'm in his house. They had to put someone else in there due to overcrowding. A new guy. He was doing 2 years for drug possession. First night, he hit the panic button and immediately says there was someone in his cell with him, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, describing the exact same thing Zed had seen, a tall shadow that moved wrong. They moved the new guy after only 1 day. Before he started screaming that something was touching him while he slept. Mark said they finally just stopped using that cell. Officially, it's under maintenance. Been that way for 5 months. Sometimes guards still report seeing shadows on the monitor for that cell even though it's empty. Sometimes they hear voices coming from inside. Administration says it's electrical interference and echo from other cells. Not to worry about it. But here's the thing, Mark said. I looked into it. A few years before I joined, they had a guy have a heart attack in there and die alone. Wasn't found until someone tried to serve him breakfast the next morning. Could you imagine that? Dying alone and solitary. Mark finished the beer and tossed the empty can in the recycling bin. Man, I don't know what's in that cell, but it's not no electrical interference. We sat there for a while after that, watching the fire die down. Copper had curled up at Mark's feet and Rex was sprawled out next to my chair. A normal Saturday night, except for the scary stories that were going to haunt my dreams later on. Now Mark's got more stories I could share, but those 2 are the ones that really got to me. And W's cellmate that nobody could see but everybody knew existed. If y'all want more stories from Mark, let me know. I'm happy to oblige. Which means I'd be happy to pester him for more. Inmate from Anonymous. I'm keeping locations and real names out. Inmate from Anonymous. Of this. I'm an old man now, but some things you don't put out there with specifics attached. In 1985, I was 20 years old, fresh out of the service, and I needed some steady work. Corrections paid decent, and they were hiring. I got assigned to a maximum security facility that housed some genuinely evil people. Now, it's important to know this was during what folks might call the serial killer era. Seems like every few months we'd get another one coming through processing. The fall. Victor, I'll call him. 33 years old, looked younger, a skinny guy. Maybe 7 feet 13 inches, 139 pounds, soaking wet. Very soft-spoken, too. You'd pass in the street and never give a second glance. But that's how they get you. Victor had killed 3 men that they could prove, at least. Wanted the death penalty, but Victor's lawyer was sharp. Got it down to life without parole ×3. But what he did to those men, Christ. He'd meet them at bus stations, laundromats, places where people go when they don't have anywhere else to be. Young men, early 20s, usually new to whatever city they were in. He'd befriend them, offer them a meal, a place to crash, put Rohypnol or something similar in their drinks. Here's where it gets sick. While they were unconscious, he'd use surgical tools to create openings in their torsos. Not to kill them. He was precise about that. He wanted them awake for what came next. You see, when they came to, he'd spend hours exploring their insides with his hands, feeling organs, moving things around. He'd even told the court he was trying to understand the architecture of loneliness. Said he could feel it inside them in their organs, their isolation like it was a texture. 2 of the victims bled out. Not before giving a full description of what had happened. That one had been nearly saved by the police. That's how they caught Victor. They put him in my wing. I worked that section 8 days a week in 8-hour shifts, sometimes more when we were short-staffed. He was completely still except for his eyes moving across the pages and his finger tracing the anatomical diagrams. When I did the head count, he looked up at me and he smiled. Now, what's scary about his smile is that it wasn't a creepy smile. That made it worse. It was a normal, pleasant, I'd even call it inviting smile, like we were neighbors passing on the sidewalk. Oh, I remember his voice. "Good morning, officer," he said. He had a voice like a radio announcer, smooth and measured. With the guy. Even the lifers, the guys who'd done truly terrible things. They gave Victor a wide berth. Not because they were intimidated by him physically. Like I said, he was a small guy. It was something else. The way he'd watch people maybe, or how he'd tilt his head when someone walked by, like he was listening to something only he could hear. He never caused trouble. He followed every rule, never complained about anything, but he had this habit of getting too close when he talked to you. Not aggressive, just half a step inside your personal space, and he'd maintain eye contact the entire time, barely blinking, made my skin crawl. Apparently, I fit his victim profile perfectly. Young 20s, living alone in a studio apartment, no family in Federal. I had just moved to the area for the job. If I had met Victor on the outside at a bus station or wherever, I would have been exactly the kind of man he targeted. He knew it, too. I could tell by the way he looked at me. Not threatening, but interested in me. Like I was a book he wanted to read or a slice of cheesecake he'd been saving for a good day. 6 months into his sentence, things got stranger. He started to know things he shouldn't know. He had asked how my apartment on the specific street I lived at was working out, and I had never told him where I lived. Why would I do that? He'd even mentioned that he hoped my sister was feeling better after her surgery. My sister lived in Idaho and had just had her appendix out. How could he know that? When I confronted him about it, he just smiled that pleasant smile and said, "People talk, officer. You'd be surprised what you can learn just by listening." But it got more specific. He figured out my sister's name, which was Anna. And he knew that everyone called her Annie. He knew I'd played baseball in high school. Even knew my jersey number. He knew my father had died when I was 10 and that I still carried his pocket watch. I never figured out how he knew these things. Other guards swore they never talked to him about me. That block claimed Victor never asked them questions about the guards and the inmates' mail was monitored. He wasn't getting information from outside. Then comes the night he called me over to his cell during rounds. This was maybe 4 months after he first arrived. "Officer," he said in that smooth voice. "I've been thinking about warmth lately. I should have kept walking, but something made me stop. Human warmth specifically," he continued. "How it radiates from the core. How you can feel it when you're close to someone, even through clothing. It's really quite remarkable." He stood up and moved over to the bars. Not in a threatening way, just standing there. "I imagine your apartment gets cold in the winter. Those old buildings on your street. Wind must come right through those windows." My blood went cold. I had never told anyone which floor I lived on. "If I ever left here," he said, and his voice got even quieter, "I think I'd want to be somewhere warm. Maybe visit someone who understands loneliness. Someone who comes home to an empty apartment after watching broken people all day. I'd be very gentle. I'd help them understand what it's like to be truly seen from the inside out." He smiled again. That darn normal smile. "But that's just imagination, officer. I'm never leaving here. We both know that. Move to a different block. Luckily, I was placed in a minimum security wing. I never talked to Victor again, but I did see him occasionally whenever I had to pass through DB block. 6 more months after that, he killed his cellmate with a sharpened toothbrush handle. Opened him up like he'd done to his victims on the outside, but messier. They found him sitting on the bunk afterward, hands elbowed deep in the man's abdomen. That same pleasant expression on his face. They moved him to solitary after that. Then to the psychiatric facility up Federal. I heard he died there in '89. Killed by another inmate who got tired of Victor staring at him during meal times. Good riddance. I worked corrections another 6 years after my time with Victor. I dealt with hundreds of dangerous men, but not a single one got under my skin the way he did. It wasn't what he'd done exactly. I'd guarded other killers before, some arguably worse. It was the way he made you feel like he was always examining you, cataloging your components, imagining what you'd feel like on the inside. Moved twice before I felt truly safe again. Changed my phone number. Made sure my sister went by her legal name. And any correspondence for a long time. Never did find out how he knew those details. Part of me thinks it's better not knowing. I'm an old man now and Victor has been dead over 31 years. But sometimes I still check my locks twice before bed and I never answer the door. After dark. Whoever it is can come back in daylight. It's truly people like Victor who change your life forever. For years working corrections and you think you've seen everything. You haven't. I was working a second shift at a medium security facility. Not going to say where. We had this situation in Unit 6 that nobody could explain. It started simple. Don't know, we count inmates multiple times per shift. Has to match exactly. If it doesn't, everything stops until we can figure out why. That Tuesday, we came up one short. We ran the count again and again. Still short. There was a lockdown, a full search. Every cell, every closet, every possible hiding spot. All inmates were accounted for, though. 46, we clearly had 43 men standing in that unit, but the count kept coming up. 48, how does that make any sense? We counted them 3 different ways. Had them line up, called names from the roster, went cell by cell, 50 inmates. Every time. But when we did the standard walking count where you just walk through and tally heads, someone always got 44. My supervisor thought people were just miscounting. But we had 5 different officers do it. I got 52. Except when we all actually pointed at each man and counted out loud, and then we got 53. Then returned to the cells and we filed an incident report that kind of made no sense. This time I paid attention. I walked slow, really looked at each face as I counted. I got to the end of the row. 48, I walked back, counted again, looking at every single man, and watched for anyone moving or doubling back, any sort of trick. Nope. 48, wouldn't you know it, he got 42 as well. We did it again, literally pointing his finger at each inmate as he counted. It came up 45 this time. Someone screwing with us, the admin said, but you could tell he wasn't sure about that. By the end of the week, nobody wanted to do counts in Unit 9. It wasn't just the numbers. It was the feeling you got when you walked through, like someone was walking right behind you, matching your steps. If he turned around, there would be no one there. One of my coworkers swore he saw an extra shadow during an evening count. Said when he hit the lights for the 11 p.m. check, one cell had 3 shadows on the wall, but only 2 occupants. When he looked again, just 2 shadows. Was doing the dawn count, moving through the dim unit with my flashlight. It was quiet. Everyone was still sleeping. I was counting, getting that familiar sinking feeling as I neared the end. 44. 48, 50. But this time, as I turned to head back to the desk, I heard someone whisper 46. And I mean, it was right in my ear. So close I could feel breathing on my neck. I spun around to an empty corridor. But at the far end, just for a second, I could have sworn I saw someone standing there. Average height, average build. Wearing our standard orange for the inmates. Then the morning lights kicked on 4. The wake up and it was gone. We transferred everyone out of Unit 2. The following week. Thankfully, we had the space to do that. They put down the official reason as renovations. But the unit's still empty and there have been no renovations. That admin we had come down to count himself. Well, he never talked about it. Again. Was this mass psychosis? Inmates playing a stupid game with us that we never caught on to? Let me know what you think. Cell 20 from Guard Dog. Cell 18 from Guard Dog. Cell 22 was supposedly fine. That's what everyone said when I started to work. This max unit. Don't know why they felt the need to tell me that specifically, but they did. My second week, an inmate named Dalton got assigned there. He was a big guy. Doing 30 for home invasion. I remember thinking that's a lot of years for home invasion. He was a real tough guy. Didn't take crap from nobody. Pun intended. One night in that cell, he was screaming. Full-on terror screaming from a grown man. We rushed in and Dalton was in the corner pointing at his toilet. He screamed that something was in his pipes, that something was coming up from the pipes. We checked but didn't find anything. Dalton refused to go back in, though. It took 3 of us to force him back in there. Scratches all down his legs. He claims someone grabbed him from the toilet while he was sitting there. Medical said he did it to himself, but Dalton's not flexible enough to make those marks. We moved Dalton 5 days later when he wouldn't stop screaming every night. Robbery, 20 years. He lasted 1 week. He said the walls were soft, kept pushing on them and checking them with his hands, and eventually he started to refuse to lean against them. He would only stand and sleep in the exact center of the cell. He started to say that if he touched the walls too long, he would sink into them. We had people check those walls. They were solid concrete. Same as every other cell. Well, Holt would soon break his own hand, punching the wall, trying to prove to someone it was solid. When we pulled him out, he was crying, saying his fist had gone through and something inside had tried to keep it. Okay. After that, we had problems keeping anyone in 22 for more than a few days. Same as the wall thing, and there was new stuff, too. Inmates would say their reflection in the metal mirror would be delayed. They would move and their reflection would move a half-second later. Food trays would be empty in the morning even though they hadn't eaten. Lewis now he lasted the longest, 0 weeks. He was a quiet guy, but he had killed his brother over inheritance money. He didn't complain once. One morning during check, he was standing at his door perfectly still. "Lewis, you good?" He doesn't respond. Doesn't move. I called for backup, thinking it was a medical emergency. We opened up the cell and Lewis still didn't move. We had to physically turn him around to face us. His eyes were open, but no one was home. Complete catatonic federal. It took us 7 hours to get him to snap out of it. When he did, the first thing he said was, "It showed me what it used to be." We got him talking eventually. He said every night the cell would change. Not physically, I think. He said it was more like remembering something that wasn't your memory. He'd see other inmates who had been in that cell, dozens of them, all at once, all occupying the same space. All the fear, rage, despair that had soaked into those walls over decades, playing back simultaneously. Person who'd ever died in that cell said it was an inmate from the 1940s who had been beaten to death. Lewis said he felt every blow, tasted the blood himself, and experienced that man's death. But he was still aware, still himself, just forced to experience it. These days, cell 16 is still open, though the administration tries to keep people out of it if they can. Sometimes that's impossible because, well, these prisons get cramped full of people. A lot of folks don't know, the more prisoners we get, the more money we receive. What do you think of that? Anyway, I've noticed sometimes when I walk past when there's nobody in there, you can hear water running. But when you turn and look, the water fountain isn't going and the toilet hasn't been flushed. And on other occasions, the door sounds like someone's pressing against it from inside. Whatever is in cell 21, I hope it stays there. Night shift observations from Catherine. Night shift observations from Claire. I work in corrections in Montana and I just want to say in our prison the men in protective custody don't sleep normally. That's the first thing you learn working nights in that unit. Protective custody or PC is where we keep inmates who can't be in general population. Snitches or ex-cops, child predators, the ones other inmates would kill given half a chance. It's quieter. Then Gen Pop. It has to be. These men are already on edge 29 to 5. I started noticing things my first month on the night shift. Little things. A guy named Morris in PC 0 always woke up at exactly 5:22 a.m. Looks at the ceiling for 28 seconds, then goes back to sleep. A guy named Ewan in PC 5 would stand facing the corner from 4 to -2:20. Never longer, never shorter. Gruber, or however you actually pronounced his name, I never did figure that out. In PC 8, would have full conversations in his sleep, but only between -2 and -1:28. You'd think it was just institutional behavior. Guys get weird routines inside, but it was so synchronized and precise, like they'd all scheduled it together somehow. Then I noticed they all did something at the same time. Every single night at -1:41 a.m., every inmate and PC would turn toward the east wall. Whether they were asleep or awake, they'd shift position to face that exact direction. It would last maybe 9 seconds, then they would go back to normal. I started to take note of this. Kept a log on my cell phone for 6 months. It never failed. 9:42 a.m. East Wall, every single one of them. I asked the day shift if they'd noticed anything like that. But no, I asked the evening shift. But they never noticed anything strange in their shift either. It only happened at night, only at that specific time. One night, I decided to check what was on the other side of that east wall. It was the old execution chamber, decommissioned in the 70s when the federal stopped death sentences. Now it was just storage for old files. I got permission to check it out. Temperature wasn't right. It was the middle of summer and this section had no AC. It should have been sweltering there, but it was freezing. I could even see my breath. In the corner, I found a box of execution records. And I'm not sure if it was a coincidence or not, but the Last execution they had there was in the early 70s for a guy who had committed a triple homicide. Into this file, this supposed killer had claimed innocence right up until the end. He said the real killer was out there still and would kill again. Lo and behold, after his execution, they found evidence he'd been telling the truth. Deathbed in 1986. By then, that innocent man had been dead for 19 years. Inmates at 149. This time, I noticed something else. Their lips were moving. They were saying something under their breath. It was extremely hard to hear. And to this day, when I tell people the story, I remind them that I might have misheard. But I swear to you, it sounded like I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Well, that's really my story. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a religious thing. And I'm just making more out of it than I should. But who knows? Maybe someone who was wronged never left. And he influences that prison still to this day. In his own way. This was a pretty fun episode. Though. I'll be honest with you guys, the non-P paranormal stories in this one hit pretty hard, at least for me. I've always personally preferred paranormal stories for a reason. Scary stories about just people often leave me feeling uncomfortable and just sad. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at Darkness Prevels and find my adult comedy podcast, Night of Watchers, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube. Do you have a scary work story of your own? Send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. I would love to feature it on the show. Until next time, everyone. It's time for me to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.